billion. That is how much the Americans spent on drones, satellites, and surveillance systems in Afghanistan. Billion. With a B. And you know what? A Taliban commander made all of it look like an expensive joke. He vanished. Again and again. The most powerful military on Earth could not find one man walking through the mountains. But here is where the story gets absolutely wild. 4 Australians with paper maps and pencils found him in 6 days. No drones, no satellites, no GPS, just their eyes and skills that most people thought had gone extinct decades ago. How is that even possible? What did these Australians know that the entire American intelligence apparatus did not? And why has this story been buried in classified files for over a decade? I am about to tell you something that the Pentagon really does not want you to hear. A secret so embarrassing that it rewrote the entire playbook for special operations forces worldwide. We are talking about ancient techniques passed down from Vietnam, tracking methods so effective they cannot be defeated by any technology, and a capture so humiliating for American pride that it changed how SEALs are trained to this day. You think modern warfare is all about gadgets and computers? Think again. What you're about to discover will completely shatter everything you believe about military technology. Stay with me until the end. Because the final revelation, it is going to blow your mind. Let us begin. The American drone operator stared at his screen in frustration. Somewhere below, in the maze of mud-walled compounds stretching across Uruzgan Province, a Taliban commander known only as the Shadow had vanished again, for the 3rd time in 72 hours. Thermal imaging showed nothing. Satellite feeds revealed empty courtyards. Radio intercepts had gone silent 6 hours ago. The most sophisticated surveillance network ever deployed in human warfare had been defeated by a man who probably could not read. But what happened next would become one of the most closely guarded secrets of the entire Afghan campaign. In a cramped operations center filled with flickering screens and humming servers, an Australian sergeant with sun-cracked skin and eyes older than his years reached over and switched off his GPS unit. Then he unfolded a paper map that looked like it belonged in a museum, and he smiled. That smile would haunt the American intelligence officers for years, because within 48 hours, the Shadow would be captured, not by drones, not by satellites, not by the billion-dollar infrastructure of the American surveillance state, but by a handful of bearded Australians using techniques their grandfathers had perfected in the jungles of Vietnam half a century earlier. And the Americans were about to learn that everything they believed about modern warfare was wrong. The American Special Operations community had arrived in Afghanistan with absolute confidence in their technological superiority. And why would they not? By 2010, a single Navy SEAL team carried more computing power than the entire Apollo space program. Their helmets contained night vision systems that could detect a lit cigarette from 2 kilometers away. Their radios bounced signals off military satellites in geosynchronous orbit. Their rifles fired rounds designed by NASA engineers. Each operator wore roughly $300,000 worth of equipment. They looked like soldiers from a science fiction film. They felt invincible. But invincibility is a dangerous illusion, and the desert was about to shatter it completely. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment operators who arrived at the same forward operating bases looked like they had stepped out of a completely different century. Their uniforms were faded by desert sun to an almost white color. Their weapons were often older models, held together in some cases by tape and determination. They carried paper maps folded into their chest rigs. Several wore bush hats that their fathers had worn in Vietnam. They drank tea instead of energy drinks. They moved slowly, deliberately, like men who had all the time in the world. The Americans initially viewed these strange visitors with something between pity and confusion. One Army Ranger later admitted that his first thought upon seeing an SASR patrol was that Australia must have sent their reserve unit by mistake. Another described them as looking like extras from a war film about the 1960s. The gear gap seemed almost embarrassing. While American operators checked tablet computers and adjusted electronic countermeasures, the Australians sat in corners and stared at nothing. They rarely spoke. They never seemed to hurry. What the Americans did not understand was that this silence concealed something far more dangerous than any technology they possessed. Something strange happened over the following months. Something the official histories do not discuss. The American units began to notice that whenever a mission went wrong, whenever the technology failed, whenever the enemy seemed to have vanished into thin air, the Australians succeeded. They found targets that satellites could not see. They tracked enemies through terrain that thermal imaging could not penetrate. They moved through hostile villages without triggering a single warning, and they did it all in almost complete silence. The question began to circulate through the American Special Operations community like a whisper that nobody wanted to acknowledge out loud. How were the Australians doing it? What did they know that all the technology could not teach? And why did their eyes look so much like the eyes in those old photographs from the Vietnam War? The answer to that question requires a journey back through 5 decades of Australian military history. Because what the Americans were witnessing in Afghanistan was not innovation, it was inheritance. It was knowledge passed down from generation to generation like a sacred flame. And its origins lay in a jungle hell that most modern soldiers could not imagine surviving. In 1966, deep in the jungles of Phuoc Tuy Province in South Vietnam, a small unit of Australian soldiers developed a set of techniques that would eventually be classified as some of the most effective unconventional warfare methods ever created. These men were called the Special Air Service, and they had been given an impossible task: patrol the jungle, find the enemy, do it without being seen, heard, or detected. Do it for weeks at a time. Do it with supplies you carry on your back. Do it knowing that rescue is impossible if you are compromised. What emerged from those green hellscapes would change the nature of special operations forever. The Australians called it the silent method. It was not written in any manual. It was not taught in any classroom. It was passed from man to man, patrol to patrol, generation to generation. And its core principle was simple but terrifying in its implications. Technology fails. Enemies adapt. The only advantage that cannot be countered is the ability to become invisible. The silent method taught operators to move through hostile territory without leaving any trace of their passage, not just avoiding visual detection, avoiding sound, avoiding smell, avoiding the subtle disturbance in the natural environment that trained enemies could detect without even knowing what they were sensing. A Vietnamese tracker could tell if someone had passed through an area hours ago by the way insects behaved, by the angle of disturbed leaves, by the faint scent of foreign soap or tobacco. The Australians learned to defeat all of it, and then they learned something even more valuable. They stopped using soap entirely. They ate the same food as the local population. They learned to walk in a way that distributed their weight to avoid breaking twigs or compressing soil. They communicated through hand signals so elaborate that entire operational plans could be conveyed in complete silence. They developed the ability to remain motionless for hours, controlling their breathing, slowing their heartbeats, becoming as still as the jungle around them. Veterans described it as learning to think like a ghost, learning to exist without existing. But the most remarkable skill the Vietnam-era SASR developed was one that would prove decisive in Afghanistan 40 years later. They learned to track, not with technology, not with dogs, with their eyes, their knowledge, and their infinite patience. They could follow a single enemy through miles of jungle by reading marks in the dirt that no one else could see. A scuff on a root, a broken spider web at exactly head height, a stone turned to show its damp underside. Each detail was a word in a language that only they could read. When those original operators returned from Vietnam, they did not write their knowledge into manuals. They taught it to the next generation directly, and those men taught the next, and so on for 50 years, until the skills arrived in Afghanistan carried by sun-weathered soldiers who had no idea they were about to prove that the most expensive military technology on Earth was worthless against a patient man with trained eyes. The hunt for the Shadow began in the autumn of 2010. American intelligence had identified him as one of the most effective Taliban commanders in southern Afghanistan. His real name was never confirmed. His face was never photographed. His voice had been intercepted exactly once, speaking in a dialect so rare that it took 3 weeks to find a translator. He operated in Uruzgan Province, an area so remote and hostile that it was known among coalition forces as the dark side of the moon. But what made the Shadow truly dangerous was not his brutality. It was his intelligence. Everything about the Shadow suggested a commander of unusual sophistication. He never used cell phones. He never appeared in the same location twice. His fighters moved in patterns that seemed random until analysts realized they were designed specifically to exploit the blind spots in drone coverage. He had somehow obtained detailed knowledge of American surveillance capabilities and was using that knowledge to remain invisible. 3 separate operations to capture him had failed. 2 had resulted in American casualties. The 3rd had ended in complete embarrassment when the assault force raided a compound that the Shadow had abandoned exactly 90 minutes before their arrival. Someone was leaking information. That much was certain. But the greater problem was even more troubling. Even without the leaks, American intelligence simply could not locate the Shadow with any reliability. The drones that could track a vehicle across 400 kilometers of desert were useless against a man who traveled only on foot, only at night, and only through terrain so rugged that thermal signatures were masked by rock walls heated by the desert sun. He had turned the American technological advantage into a weakness. He had made the billion-dollar surveillance network look like an expensive joke. The American commander in Uruzgan at the time was a SEAL officer with multiple combat deployments and absolute faith in the systems at his disposal. He had access to resources that previous generations of warriors could not have imagined. Real-time satellite imagery, signals intelligence teams monitoring every radio frequency, informant networks in dozens of villages, unmanned aerial vehicles flying 24-hour coverage patterns. He had everything except what he actually needed. He had no idea where the Shadow was. It was at this point that the Australian liaison officer made a suggestion that would initially be dismissed as either a joke or an insult. Turn off the technology. Stop looking at the screens. Send a tracking team. The American commander reportedly laughed. The year was 2010, not 1970. They were fighting a modern war with modern tools. Tracking was something from old Western films. It was not a serious intelligence methodology, but the Australian officer did not laugh. He simply waited, because he knew something the American commander would learn soon enough. The old ways worked. They had always worked. And in certain situations, they were the only things that worked. The SASR tracking team that deployed 3 days later consisted of just 4 men. Their equipment would have looked familiar to soldiers from any era of the past century. Binoculars, paper maps, compasses, canteens, basic rations. Their weapons were functional rather than fancy. They carried no tablets, no satellite communication devices, no GPS units. When they crossed the wire and disappeared into the lunar landscape of southern Uruzgan, the American officers watching from the operations center felt they were witnessing either an act of incredible bravery or an elaborate form of professional suicide. They had no idea what they were actually witnessing, but they were about to find out. The team was led by a warrant officer whose name remains classified to this day. He had been in the regiment for 17 years. He had served in East Timor, Iraq, and multiple rotations in Afghanistan. But more importantly, he had learned his craft from men who had learned it in Vietnam. He could read terrain the way other people read newspapers. He could detect the passage of a single human being through an area that looked completely undisturbed. He had once tracked a wounded enemy fighter for 19 kilometers across rock-strewn hills by following nothing more than occasional drops of blood smaller than a fingernail. What this man understood, and what the Americans were about to learn, was that technology had not made tracking obsolete. It had simply made everyone forget how to do it. The Taliban commanders like the Shadow, who had learned to evade drones and satellites, had never learned to evade the oldest form of human hunting, because they did not know it still existed. The tracking team began their work at the last known location of the Shadow. It was a compound that American forces had raided 3 weeks earlier, finding nothing. The thermal imaging had shown no human presence. The drone footage had revealed no movement. The signals intelligence had detected no communications. But within 30 minutes of arriving at the site, the Australian warrant officer had found what the entire American surveillance apparatus had missed. Footprints, not obvious ones. Not the kind that anyone would notice on casual inspection, but subtle compressions in the dust near a doorway, slight disturbances in the pattern of debris that covered the courtyard, a stone that had been moved sometime in the recent past and placed in a position that blocked the line of sight from a specific ridge where the Americans liked to place observation posts. The Shadow had been there, recently, perhaps within the past 48 hours, and he had left a trail that only someone trained to see it could follow. What followed over the next 6 days would become the subject of classified debriefings and professional military education seminars for years to come. 4 Australian soldiers, operating with almost no technological support, tracked a Taliban commander through some of the most hostile terrain on Earth, while that same commander evaded a multi-billion-dollar surveillance network without apparent difficulty. But the Shadow had made one critical mistake. He had prepared for the future while ignoring the past. The trail led through what is so deep and narrow that drone cameras could not see their floors. It crossed ridgelines by routes that kept the traveler below the horizon at all times. It used cave systems and overhangs that blocked thermal imaging. The Shadow understood exactly how the Americans hunted, and he had designed his movement patterns to defeat every sensor they possessed. But he did not understand the Australians. He did not know that someone could follow his passage through hard rock by examining the subtle wear patterns on the edges of stones. He did not know that the way he had steadied himself against a boulder while descending a cliff face had left microscopic traces of human skin oil that would persist for days. He did not know that the Australians could estimate how many hours ago he had passed a certain point by examining the moisture content of disturbed soil. Every step he took told a story, and the Australians were reading every word. The tracking team moved in a pattern that American observers found bizarre when they were later briefed on the operation. They did not hurry. They stopped frequently. They sometimes spent an hour examining a single square meter of ground. They communicated almost entirely through hand signals, maintaining a silence so complete that friendly units sometimes walked within 50 meters of them without knowing they were there. On the 4th day, they found something that changed the entire operation. A small piece of fabric caught on a thorn bush. It was green. It was synthetic. And it was exactly the color of the Pakistani military uniforms that had been reported in the region. The Shadow was not just a Taliban commander. He was connected to something much larger. Something the Americans had suspected but never confirmed. But even more importantly, the fabric told the Australian trackers that they were close, very close. The Shadow was slowing down. He was feeling safe. He was approaching his destination, and that feeling of safety would be his undoing. The compound where the Shadow had taken refuge sat at the end of a valley so remote that it did not appear on any coalition map. American satellites had photographed the area thousands of times, but had categorized the structure as abandoned due to the complete absence of thermal signatures, vehicle tracks, or communication emissions. The Shadow had chosen it precisely because it was invisible to the systems hunting him. But the Australian trackers saw what the satellites could not. They saw the way the dust had been disturbed around the entrance. They saw the subtle paths worn into the hillside by feet ascending to observation points. They saw the remains of a cooking fire that had been so carefully concealed that only someone knowing exactly what to look for could detect it. The shadow was inside, and he had no idea that anyone was watching. What happened next demonstrated the full terrifying capability of the SASR tracking methodology. The 4 Australians did not call for reinforcements. They did not request drone strikes. They did not even report their location to the operations center. Instead, they settled into observation positions and began to map every detail of the compound and its surroundings. Over the next 36 hours, they identified every sentry position. They timed every guard change. They noted every entry and exit. They learned the rhythms of the compound as intimately as if they had lived there themselves. When they finally reported their findings, the American SEAL commander initially refused to believe them. His satellites showed nothing. His drones showed nothing. His signals intelligence showed nothing. But the Australians had a map drawn in pencil on the back of a ration packet, and it showed everything. The decision to proceed based solely on tracking intelligence became one of the most controversial choices of the entire campaign. If the Australians were wrong, the raid would not only fail, but would potentially compromise months of intelligence work and alert the Shadow to the new methodology being used against him. If they were right, it would prove that human observation could succeed where billion-dollar systems had failed. The American commander made his decision, and it would change the way Special Operations Forces thought about intelligence forever. The raid that followed was conducted in absolute silence. The assault team was mixed, American and Australian, but the approach plan was entirely Australian in design. There would be no helicopter insertion, no explosive breaching, no suppressive fire. Instead, the team approached on foot over 18 hours, moving so slowly and carefully that they covered only 4 kilometers in that entire time. The final assault happened at 3:17 in the morning during the deepest phase of human sleep. The compound defenders never fired a shot. The Shadow was captured in his bed, waking only when he felt the muzzle of a suppressed rifle pressed against his forehead. In his subsequent interrogation, he would admit that he had never heard the approaching soldiers. He had never suspected they were coming. He had believed himself to be completely invisible. He had defeated the drones. He had defeated the satellites. He had defeated the greatest technological surveillance network in human history, but he had not defeated 4 dusty Australians with paper maps and patient eyes. The aftermath of the Shadow operation sent shockwaves through the American Special Operations community that have never fully subsided. Here was undeniable proof that their faith in technology had created a critical vulnerability. They had become so dependent on screens and sensors that they had forgotten the most basic skills of warfare, skills that their enemies had never forgotten, skills that could not be jammed, hacked, or evaded because they existed entirely in human knowledge and human patience. And the implications extended far beyond this single operation. The SEAL commander who had initially dismissed the Australian tracking proposal became one of its most vocal advocates. In classified briefings that leaked to professional military journals years later, he admitted that the operation had fundamentally changed his understanding of what Special Operations Forces should be. Technology was a tool, not a solution. Sensors could be fooled. Satellites could be evaded. But an operator who understood the land, who could read the signs left by human passage, who could move through hostile territory without leaving any trace of his own existence, that operator possessed a capability that no amount of money could replicate. In the years following the operation, American Special Operations units began requesting Australian training teams with increasing frequency. The requests focused specifically on skills that had been considered obsolete for decades: tracking, silent movement, long-range reconnaissance without electronic support, navigation by map and compass, communication by hand signal, the old ways. the ways that still worked when everything else failed. But learning these skills would prove far more difficult than the Americans had anticipated. Some of these training programs continue to this day, though their details remain classified. What is known is that American operators who complete the Australian tracking course describe it as the most humbling experience of their professional lives. Men who have jumped from aircraft at 30,000 feet, who have conducted underwater infiltrations in freezing waters, who have survived the most brutal selection processes in the military world, routinely fail their first attempts at basic Australian tracking exercises. They cannot see what the Australians see. They have been trained to look at screens, not at dirt. The problem is deeper than simple skill deficiency. It is a philosophical gap that separates two entirely different approaches to warfare. The American approach asks, what technology can we deploy to solve this problem? The Australian approach asks, what can I see, hear, smell, and feel that tells me the truth about what has happened here? One approach relies on systems. The other relies on senses. And in certain critical situations, only one of them works. The men who served in the SASR tracking teams in Afghanistan share certain characteristics that observers have noted repeatedly over the years. They tend to be older than their American counterparts, with an average age in the early 30s compared to the American late 20s. They speak less. They move more slowly. They seem almost contemplative in their approach to their profession, treating each operation as a problem to be studied rather than a challenge to be overwhelmed with violence and speed. But the most striking characteristic is something that visiting American officers consistently describe in the same words: the eyes. These men have eyes that look through you rather than at you, eyes that seem to be seeing something that exists in a different reality. Eyes that have been described as simultaneously ancient and aware, the same look that appears in photographs of Vietnam-era long-range reconnaissance patrol members, the same look that appears in paintings of Aboriginal trackers from the 19th century, the same look, perhaps, that appeared in the eyes of every human being who ever hunted other human beings across wild terrain. This look is not something that can be trained. It emerges from something deeper. From spending so much time reading the small details of the natural world that a fundamental shift occurs in perception. From learning to see not just what is present, but what was present. From understanding that every environment tells a story in a language that most modern humans have forgotten how to read. The Australians call this state of awareness going bush. It is not mysticism. It is not meditation. It is an intensely practical reorientation of attention toward the patterns that reveal the passage of time and movement through space. A skilled tracker in this state can walk through a valley and reconstruct the movements of everyone who has passed through it in recent days. He can tell you how many people there were. He can tell you how much they weighed. He can tell you whether they were hurrying or moving carefully. He can tell you, sometimes, whether they were afraid. This capability exists because of one simple truth that technological warfare has obscured. Human beings leave traces. Every step compresses soil. Every hand that steadies against a rock leaves oils behind. Every passage through vegetation disturbs patterns that take time to return to normal. These traces are invisible to cameras. They are invisible to thermal sensors. They are invisible to satellites. But they are not invisible to the trained human eye. And in Afghanistan, where the enemy had learned to disappear from the technological battlefield, these traces became the most valuable intelligence available. The story of the Shadow's capture spread through the special operations community in fragments and rumors before the first classified briefings occurred. American operators who had been present during the operation were reportedly cautious in their descriptions, aware that they were admitting to a fundamental failure in their own methodology, but they could not deny what they had witnessed. One account that emerged from these conversations described the moment when the Australian tracking team reported that they had located the Shadow's compound. The American intelligence officers at the operations center pulled up every sensor feed available. Satellite imagery showed nothing. Drone thermal imaging showed nothing. Signals intelligence showed nothing. Yet the Australians were claiming, based on nothing more than observations of dirt and stones and disturbed vegetation, that the most wanted commander in the region was sitting in a specific building in a specific valley. The senior American officer reportedly demanded some form of technological confirmation before approving an assault. The Australian liaison officer refused to provide one. There was nothing to provide. The tracking data existed in a form that could not be uploaded to a computer or transmitted via satellite link. It existed in pencil marks on a paper map and in the minds of 4 men sitting in a wadi 12 kilometers from the nearest coalition position. The Americans had to make a choice: trust the technology that showed nothing, or trust the Australians who claimed to see everything. The decision to proceed based solely on tracking intelligence became one of the most controversial choices of the entire campaign. If the Australians were wrong, the raid would not only fail, but would potentially compromise months of intelligence work and alert the Shadow to the new methodology being used against him. If they were right, it would prove that human observation could succeed where billion-dollar systems had failed. They were right. The implications of the Afghan tracking operations extend far beyond the immediate military context. They raise fundamental questions about the relationship between human capability and technological assistance that apply to every field where this relationship exists. The American approach to warfare in the early 21st century was built on an assumption that technology would eventually solve every problem. Enough sensors, enough computing power, enough satellite coverage, and the battlefield would become completely transparent. Enemies would have nowhere to hide. Victory would become a matter of identifying and eliminating targets with industrial efficiency. This assumption shaped procurement decisions worth hundreds of billions of dollars. It shaped training programs for an entire generation of warriors. It shaped the very language used to discuss military operations. But the assumption was wrong. It was wrong because it failed to account for the adaptive capability of human opponents. The Taliban commanders who learned to evade drones were not technological geniuses. They were simply paying attention. They watched the patterns of surveillance. They noted the capabilities and limitations of the sensors hunting them. They adjusted their behavior accordingly. And within a few years, they had rendered much of the American technological investment functionally useless. What the Australians brought to Afghanistan was not superior technology. It was older technology. Technology so old that it predated the concept of technology entirely. The ability to track another human being by reading the signs of their passage is one of the most ancient capabilities of the human species. It was essential for hunting before agriculture existed. It was essential for warfare before metal existed. It is hardwired into human perception in ways that neuroscientists are only beginning to understand. And it cannot be defeated by any countermeasure that an enemy might devise, because defeating it would require leaving no trace at all. It would require walking through the world without interacting with the world. It would require being not just invisible, but absent, and that is something that no living creature can achieve. The training pipeline that produces SASR trackers begins with a selection process that emphasizes different qualities than most elite military units seek. Physical fitness matters, of course. Mental resilience matters. But what the Australian selectors look for most intensely is something they describe as awareness. The ability to notice details that others miss. The willingness to slow down when others would speed up. The patience to observe when others would act. These qualities are identified through exercises that would seem strange to observers accustomed to conventional military training. Candidates are shown photographs of terrain and asked to describe what has happened there. They are taken into wilderness areas and asked to follow trails left by instructors days or weeks earlier. They are placed in environments and told to detect the presence of hidden observers. They are tested not on their ability to do things, but on their ability to see things. Those who pass selection enter a training program that has been passed down with modifications for over 50 years. Much of this program remains classified, but elements that have been discussed publicly focus on the development of perceptual acuity to levels that seem almost supernatural to untrained observers. Trackers learn to identify individual footprints and connect them to specific individuals based on gait patterns, weight distribution, and wear patterns on footwear. They learn to estimate the age of disturbances in soil and vegetation based on moisture content, insect activity, and the behavior of plant material. They learn to detect human scent in areas where no visible sign of passage exists. They learn to read weather patterns, animal behavior, and subtle environmental shifts as sources of information about human activity. But perhaps most importantly, they learn to synthesize all of this information into a coherent picture without technological assistance. They learn to hold vast quantities of observational data in their minds and process it continuously as new information arrives. They learn to make predictions about enemy behavior based not on signals intelligence or satellite imagery, but on direct observation of how that enemy has moved through the landscape. This capability requires hundreds of hours of practice in varied environments. It requires exposure to conditions of fatigue, stress, and discomfort that would impair normal cognitive function. It requires the systematic breakdown of perceptual habits developed over a lifetime of living in a technological society where attention is directed at screens rather than at the natural world. When the training is complete, the result is something that American officers consistently describe in the same terms. They say the Australians can see things that are not there. They mean this as a statement of admiration, not supernatural belief. What the Australians see is not invisible. It is simply outside the perceptual range of those who have not been trained to see it. The Shadow's capture produced intelligence that led to a cascade of subsequent operations across Uruzgan Province. His knowledge of Taliban networks, Pakistani connections, and operational planning proved extraordinarily valuable, but the intelligence community also extracted something else from the operation: a detailed understanding of how the Shadow had evaded the technological surveillance that should have made his activities impossible. The methods he had used were remarkably simple once they were understood. He had studied coalition drone patterns and moved only during gaps in coverage. He had used terrain features that blocked thermal imaging. He had avoided any location where electronic communications might be detected. He had traveled with small groups that left minimal signatures. He had used paths that avoided areas where vehicle traffic had compressed soil into surfaces that would show footprints clearly. Every element of his evasion strategy was based on defeating specific technological capabilities. And every element had been completely ineffective against the Australian tracking team because they were not using those capabilities. They were using something that the Shadow had not even known still existed in modern warfare. The irony of his capture became a teaching point in subsequent briefings. The Shadow had been so focused on defeating the technology of the future that he had been captured by the skills of the past. He had spent years learning to evade drones and satellites. He had not spent a single minute learning to avoid leaving traces in the dirt. This lesson had implications far beyond Afghanistan. It suggested that in any conflict, the side that relies exclusively on any single methodology, whether technological or traditional, creates vulnerabilities that an adaptive enemy will eventually exploit. It suggested that the diversity of approach matters as much as the sophistication of approach. It suggested that sometimes the most effective tool is not the newest tool, but the oldest one. The SEAL teams that operated alongside Australian units in the final years of the Afghan campaign underwent a gradual but significant transformation in their approach. Officers who had initially viewed Australian methods as outdated curiosities began to incorporate them into their own operations. The changes were small at first: a tracking specialist attached to missions that might require surveillance detection, paper maps carried as backups to GPS units, increased attention to the physical signs of enemy passage during site exploitation. But the changes accelerated over time, By 2012, certain SEAL teams had developed hybrid methodologies that combined American technological capability with Australian tracking and observation techniques. These units proved devastatingly effective against targets that had learned to evade conventional surveillance. They could find enemies that drones could not see. They could move through areas where electronic emissions were monitored without revealing their presence. They could operate for extended periods without satellite communication, appearing and disappearing like the ghosts their Australian teachers described. The transformation created its own challenges. The skills required for tracking and silent movement took years to develop fully. American units could not simply order their operators to attend a course and emerge with capabilities that Australian units had spent decades refining. What they could do was begin the process of cultural change that might eventually produce American trackers of comparable ability. This process continues today, though its details are closely guarded. What is known is that American Special Operations training has increasingly emphasized the kinds of field craft that characterized military operations before the electronic age: the ability to navigate without GPS, the ability to communicate without radios, the ability to observe without sensors, the ability to move without leaving traces. These skills are now described in American military documents as low-signature operations capabilities. The terminology is new, the capabilities are ancient, and their value has been proven in the most demanding operational environment that modern special operations forces have ever encountered. The veterans of the Australian tracking operations in Afghanistan have largely returned to anonymity. Their names remain classified. Their faces have never been photographed for public release. Their specific operations are documented only in intelligence databases that will not be declassified for decades. They are ghosts who hunted ghosts, and they prefer it that way. But the influence of their work persists throughout the special operations community. The questions they raised about the relationship between technology and skill remain active areas of professional debate. The techniques they demonstrated have been adopted and adapted by units around the world. The philosophical approach they embodied, the belief that human capability remains essential even in an age of machines, has shaped the way elite military organizations think about their mission. Perhaps most importantly, they demonstrated something that extends far beyond military application. They demonstrated that the technological society has created vulnerabilities as well as capabilities, that the abandonment of traditional skills in favor of electronic assistance has left modern humans strangely helpless when that assistance is unavailable, that the knowledge preserved by indigenous cultures, by traditional communities, by anyone who maintained connection to older ways of living, retains value that cannot be measured in conventional terms. The Australian trackers in Afghanistan were not simply soldiers performing a military function. They were carriers of knowledge that had been maintained for thousands of years and that very nearly disappeared in the rush toward technological modernity. They proved that this knowledge still works. They proved that it fills gaps that no technology has yet been able to fill. And they proved that sometimes the past holds solutions that the future has not yet discovered. The compound where the Shadow was captured eventually fell into disuse as coalition forces withdrew from Afghanistan. The valley that had sheltered him returned to the silence that had characterized it for centuries before the war. The footprints and traces that the Australian trackers had followed have long since been erased by wind and weather. Nothing remains to mark what happened there. But in military training facilities around the world, the story is told and retold to each new generation of special operations candidates. It has become something close to legend. The tale of the commander who defeated billions of dollars of technology by walking carefully through the mountains, and the tale of the 4 Australians who found him by looking at the dirt. The lesson embedded in this legend is not simply about military tactics. It is about the nature of capability itself. It is about the danger of assuming that any single approach to any problem is sufficient. It is about the value of preserving knowledge that seems outdated until the moment when it becomes essential. The drones that circled over Afghanistan saw everything except what mattered. The satellites that photographed every meter of terrain captured nothing that led to the Shadow's capture. The billion-dollar surveillance network operated exactly as designed while completely failing to accomplish its purpose. And 4 men with pencils and paper maps succeeded where all of it failed. Because they remembered what the technology had forgotten. Because they could see what the screens could not show. Because they had learned, through 50 years of institutional memory stretching back to the jungles of Vietnam, that the human eye remains the most sophisticated sensor ever developed, that human patience remains the most reliable methodology ever created, that human knowledge, passed from generation to generation through direct instruction rather than digital storage, remains irreplaceable. The Americans had the technology of the future. The Australians had the instincts of the past. And in the mountains of Uruzgan, the past proved that it still had lessons to teach. The question that military planners continue to debate is not whether tracking and traditional fieldcraft retain value. That question was answered definitively in Afghanistan. The question is how to preserve these capabilities in an institutional environment that overwhelmingly favors technological solutions. The challenge is significant. Technology is quantifiable. Budgets can specify numbers of drones, satellites, and electronic systems. Training programs can be evaluated by electronic test scores. Performance can be measured by data output. Everything about technological capability fits neatly into the administrative systems that modern militaries use to manage themselves. Traditional fieldcraft fits none of these systems. The ability to track cannot be measured by standardized testing. The capacity for silent movement cannot be purchased with procurement budgets. The patience required to observe for hours without technological assistance cannot be developed through conventional training programs. These capabilities exist in human beings who cannot be manufactured, cannot be upgraded, and cannot be replaced when they retire. The Australian solution to this challenge has been to maintain the SASR as a deliberately anachronistic institution. While other special operations forces have embraced every available technology, the regiment has preserved its traditional emphasis on human capability. Technology is used where appropriate, but it is never allowed to replace the fundamental skills that define the organization. This approach requires institutional commitment that other military organizations have found difficult to sustain. Tracking instructors must be maintained even when no immediate operational requirement exists. Training time must be allocated to skills that produce no measurable output. Career paths must reward capabilities that cannot be quantified. Everything about the approach runs counter to the management principles that dominate modern military organizations. But the results in Afghanistan proved the value of this commitment. When the technology failed, the traditional skills remained. When the enemy adapted to the sensors, the trackers continued to find them. When the American Special Operations community realized it had created a critical vulnerability through its technological dependence, the Australians were there to demonstrate that an alternative approach still existed. The final lesson of the Afghan tracking operations may be the most uncomfortable for modern military planners to accept. Technology did not fail in Afghanistan because it was poorly designed or improperly employed. It failed because the enemy was human, and humans adapt. Every technological capability contains within it the seeds of its own defeat. Drones have flight patterns that can be mapped. Satellites have orbits that can be calculated. Electronic sensors have detection thresholds that can be avoided. Given sufficient motivation and time, any human opponent will learn these limitations and design countermeasures to exploit them. Traditional fieldcraft operates on a different principle. The skills it develops are not fixed capabilities with defined parameters. They are dynamic processes of observation and analysis that adapt continuously to changing circumstances. A tracker does not look for specific signatures that an enemy might learn to avoid. A tracker looks for any deviation from the natural pattern that suggests human passage. This is a fundamentally different kind of capability, and it cannot be defeated by the same methods that defeat technological systems. The Taliban commanders who learned to evade drones did not need to understand the technology of unmanned aerial vehicles. They simply needed to observe the patterns of surveillance and adjust their behavior accordingly. But to evade a skilled tracker, they would need to understand the fundamental physics of interaction with the physical environment. They would need to walk without compressing soil, to touch surfaces without leaving oils, to move through vegetation without disturbing any leaf or stem. These are not behaviors that can be learned. They are physical impossibilities. This asymmetry explains why tracking proved so effective against targets that had defeated every other methodology. The Shadow had spent years learning to evade technology. He had never learned to avoid leaving footprints because he did not know that anyone still looked at footprints. When the Australians arrived with their paper maps and patient eyes, he was as vulnerable as if he had never developed any countermeasures at all. The war in Afghanistan ended with American withdrawal in August of 2021. The Taliban returned to power. The surveillance networks that had monitored the country for 20 years were dismantled. The drones that had circled over the mountains for so long departed for other theaters of operation. But the lessons learned in those mountains persist in training programs and tactical doctrines around the world. The story of the Shadow's capture is taught to special operations candidates who will never serve in Afghanistan. The tracking techniques demonstrated by the Australians are practiced by units preparing for conflicts that have not yet begun. The questions raised about technological dependence are debated by planners who must decide how to prepare their forces for unknown future challenges. What remains after the war ends is knowledge. Knowledge that technology alone is not sufficient. Knowledge that human capability retains value that cannot be replicated by machines. Knowledge that the skills developed by warriors centuries and millennia ago remain relevant to challenges that could not have been imagined when those skills were first developed. The Australians who tracked the Shadow through the mountains of Uruzgan were not simply performing a tactical mission. They were demonstrating a principle that extends far beyond the military context. They were proving that the past is not obsolete, that traditional knowledge is not primitive, that human capability is not secondary to technological capability, but complementary to it. In an age increasingly dominated by artificial intelligence, autonomous systems, and algorithmic decision-making, this demonstration may prove more important than any specific tactical achievement. It is a reminder that humans remain essential, that skills preserved through generations of direct transmission cannot simply be uploaded to databases, that the eyes and minds and patience of trained individuals cannot be replaced by any sensor or processor yet developed. The drones were blind. The satellites were blind. The entire technological apparatus of the most powerful military in human history was blind. But 4 Australians with paper maps could see, and what they saw led to the capture of a commander who had defeated everything else. That is the legacy of the Afghan tracking operations. That is the lesson written in the dust of Uruzgan Province. And that is why, even now, in training facilities around the world, young soldiers are taught to put down their screens and look at the dirt. Because sometimes the dirt tells you what the screens cannot. The Americans never forgot what they learned in Afghanistan. The SEAL commander who had initially dismissed Australian tracking methods retired years later, having become one of its strongest advocates. In his final briefings to incoming special operations officers, he reportedly repeated a single lesson that he considered more valuable than anything else he had learned in decades of service. When your technology fails, and it will fail, what do you have left? What can you do when the screens go dark and the satellites lose track and the radios go silent? Can you navigate without GPS? Can you communicate without electronics? Can you find an enemy who has learned to evade everything you depend on? If the answer to these questions is no, then you have not truly prepared for war. You have prepared only for the wars where everything works correctly. And those wars exist only in training scenarios. The Australians understood this. They had understood it for 50 years before Afghanistan, and they understand it still. Their technology is not inferior to American technology. In many cases, it is identical, purchased from the same manufacturers, and employed according to the same doctrines. But underneath that technology, preserved through decades of institutional commitment and deliberate cultivation, lies a foundation of human capability that no technology can replace. When the shadow vanished from the screens, the Americans searched for technological solutions, better drones, more satellites, enhanced signals intelligence. The Australians searched the dirt, and the dirt told them where he was. The final irony of the Afghan campaign may be this: the most sophisticated surveillance network ever deployed in human history, supported by computing power that would have seemed magical a generation earlier, was ultimately supplemented by techniques that prehistoric hunters would have recognized immediately. A footprint is a footprint. A disturbed stone is a disturbed stone. A broken branch at head height means that someone of a certain stature passed this way. These observations are not complex. A child could be taught to make them. But they require something that no technology can provide. They require a human being to be present, to pay attention, and to understand what is being observed. The Australians brought that human presence to Afghanistan. They brought the eyes and the knowledge and the patience that the American technological approach had inadvertently abandoned. And when the technology reached its limits, when the enemy had adapted beyond what the sensors could detect, those eyes and that knowledge proved decisive. This is not an argument against technology. The drones and satellites served vital purposes throughout the campaign. They provided intelligence that saved countless lives. They enabled operations that would otherwise have been impossible. The issue was never that technology was useless, but that reliance on technology alone created vulnerabilities that a determined enemy would eventually exploit. The solution is not to abandon technology, but to supplement it with capabilities that cannot be evaded by the same methods. Human tracking cannot be defeated by studying drone flight patterns. Silent movement cannot be countered by learning which frequencies are monitored. Observation by trained human eyes cannot be avoided by staying out of satellite view. The Australians proved this in Afghanistan. They proved it by finding a commander who had defeated everything else. They proved it by demonstrating capabilities that American units had allowed to atrophy through decades of technological dependence. And they proved it by teaching American operators that the old ways still worked, if anyone still remembered how to use them. The story ends where it began, with an American drone operator staring at a screen that shows nothing, with a Taliban commander moving unseen through terrain that should have been completely transparent, with the growing recognition that something fundamental had failed. But this time, the ending is different. Because now there are 4 Australians moving through the darkness, reading signs in the dirt that no camera can capture, following a trail that no sensor can detect, closing in on a target who believes himself to be completely invisible. They do not hurry. They do not make noise. They do not leave traces of their own passage. They are ghosts hunting a ghost, and they carry knowledge older than the mountains around them. When they find him, it will not be because of any technological advantage. It will be because they remembered what everyone else had forgotten, because they preserved skills that others had discarded, because they understood that the future does not make the past irrelevant. It makes the past essential. The drones are blind, but the trackers can see. And in the darkness of Uruzgan Province, that made all the difference.